What is the effect of long-term exposure of pools plaster finish to ocean-strength salt water? What would be considered long-term?
In looking at this issue about damages generated to interior cementitious materials, tile grouts, cementitious copings, things of that nature, you got two issues, short-term, long-term. Short-term is how long were these items subjected to seawater? Because seawater, has been mentioned earlier, has a very high elevated salt TDS level, extremely high. Some of those salts in there are very potentially damaging to things like, for example, magnesium chloride can react, and depending on the age of the interior finish, the type of finish, what condition it was in prior to being submerged underwater in seawater, may affect whether or not that material is going to be durable. For example, if you had a pool that was, say, a year old, and it had a pozzolan modifier in it, and it's dense material, it's had a reduction in its porosity and permeability, it may be able to weather the storm if it was short duration. You get the pool drained, you put fresh water back into it, you may have limited damages to that surface, to the tile grout, or to coping. If, on the other hand, the thing has been underwater for a prolonged period, then you've had greater penetration by that salt water into the material, and as a result, you may have greater damages, not to just the surface itself, but also getting into the shotcrete or gunite substrate. For example, how do you know? There are different tests that can be performed, and these tests are expensive, but if you really want to know, if your pool's been underwater for 6 months with seawater, you've had, and the surface was fairly new, therefore it's fairly porous, fairly permeable, you've had penetration of chloride ion into that material. There are tests that can be conducted. Those tests are called ASTM C1152, which is an acid-soluble chloride test, and ASTM C1218, water-soluble chloride analysis. It takes a trained photographer or lab to perform those tests. But if you have a shotcrete substrate with rebar in it, what happens when you immerse a surface for a prolonged period with salt water? It's going to penetrate in there, and what is going to happen to that rebar? The chloride ion over time will deteriorate what's called the passivation zone around the rebar. It will deteriorate the steel, and you may long-term get oxidation, rust, rebar rust, and it'll be bleeding up through that shell. That's to the shell itself, which will ultimately affect the plaster or whatever type of interior finish it is. But some surfaces, short-lived exposure, it may weather if it's in good shape. Pozzolan modified material, the same with your tile grout. If your tile grout is a polymer modified tile grout, may be able to weather it. It just depends on duration, concentration. Those are essential facts that you got to look at. The first step is you document. I do work for a lot of insurance companies on these very issues, and the first thing I look at is I ask the questions. How long was the pool immersed? And go from there, because that's going to tell you the real story. And if necessary, then you do things like petrographic analysis, and you have to have a trained concrete photographer that can look at it, because there are other reactions that occur. For example, seawater reacting with plaster, just traditional plaster, white cement. The chloride ion can react with the illuminate phase inside that plaster, and you form a thing called friedel salt. Friedel salt is calcium chloroaluminate. It's highly expansive. It may start creating damages on your surface. If you have coping and water goes into the structure, gets wicked up into the coping, guess what? There is a thing called salt crystallization pressure. Salt crystallization pressure, soluble salts get wicked up into porous materials. That material in turn absorbs that, the salts get concentrated, they expand, and one of the most expansive salts is halite. What's halite? Sodium chloride. It'll blow coping apart, all kinds of damages. Cal?
In the real world that we're living in, which, and again, not to say that what you said isn't real, but again, we go into a backyard, we empty it, we're willing to acid wash it, polish it, whatever it takes to clean it up.
Right.
How am I supposed to tell every one of these people with a gunite pool in New York or Long Island that they have to hire one of these potable or whatever you call the guy?
petrographers.
photographers to come in and test the structure, or am I, you're like, what are you suggesting we do as a, I know there's no one fix for everything, Greg, but in your experience, what is the best we can do other than write it all down, warn them that we're not guaranteeing the structure for the future? What is the best fix for now?
Short-term, Cal, is document and notify. You tell them there are potential long-run risks from your pool being immersed in a concentrated salt solution, seawater, for a prolonged period of time. The ultimate proof of the pudding, if you will, is will you start developing these problems? You may not, but by the same token, where I'm from, the contractors have the responsibility to advise consumers of any foreseeable problems. You have this customer, they place their trust and confidence in you, Cal, you give them the best advice you can give them. And that advice is based on what? The questions that you ask them. How long was the pool underwater? What type of surface? How new is it? The visual site inspection that you make, Cal, you look at it, the surface looks in good shape. 6 months down the road, it still looks in good shape. You don't have any rebar oxidation in the shotcrete shell of the steel. You probably have weathered the storm okay, but what you've done now is you notify them that there are potential problems associated with this condition, and that they may. No one has a crystal ball, Cal. You can't tell sometimes just by looking at a thing. The only way to be 100% accurate is if they want to unilaterally spend the money, do the petrographic analysis, then you'll tell what was the depth of chloride penetration. Am I in risk of having rebar oxidation? So best thing you do is you can advise and watch, and that's the short-term solution. Advise and watch. Terry?
Greg, keeping in mind what you just said, is it helpful to us as inspectors trying to make determinations on these things to know how much salt is in the water? Is there a threshold?
My thing of it is, unless you know, because usually by the time you get there, or if you know, like the pool's still underwater and it's still got the seawater in it, and the sludge and the sewage and everything else, obviously the first step, and this goes back to Cal's issue, get fresh water in the pool as quickly as possible, if that's possible. But from talking to people after Hurricane Sandy, I had people tell me, Greg, I can't drain the water and put fresh water in. I got no place to drain the water. I got told that hundreds of times right after Hurricane Sandy. What do I do? And the recommendations that other members of the panel said go into effect. Get the water sanitized as quickly as possible. Do what you can long-term to get rid of that water. Because the bottom line is, seawater is not compatible with most cementitious materials unless it's been made specifically to exist in a saline seawater environment. Most pool plasters and grouts and coping, they're not meant to be underwater in a salt environment.
Question over here.
Chaz had a question.
Can I make a little addition to that?
Yes, Rick, and then Chaz will get you.
I just recommend that if you tell people that you're an expert, then they're going to hold you to that standard. So what I would do is tell them do the documentation that Greg said, offer them the petrographic services, and then take the lesson from the car rental companies, make them sign a piece of paper saying, no, they don't want it. And then down the road, if something does go wrong, you've offered the service, you've not told them that you're an expert, you've not told them that you're Greg Garrett, and you have a piece of paper saying that they did not want the petrographic analysis.
Chaz, did you have a question?
Yeah, just to follow up on a plaster pool that's going to get drained and then potentially re-plastered. Is it enough, because I've heard two different sides of this, to just drain a pool, put a bond and re-plaster, or if it's been submerged in seawater for some time, does that pool need to be sandblasted or water blasted before a good bond is taken before you re-plaster that surface?
Chaz, the question that you asked is, as Cal says, a great question. The first thing you got to look at is long-term damages are not going to be associated with just that thing being in water. But if you've had salt, as in ocean water, sitting in that thing, you've had penetration of the chloride ion, not just in the plaster, but in the shotcrete shell. That's where the real long-term problems are going to exist, because that's going to affect the concrete itself, the passivation zone on all the steel, and that's where the real thing is. If you start getting 15, 16, 20 rebar bleed-throughs within a couple months. Bottom line, you're going to have to drain that pool, strip it, and then you're going to have to prep it. And how do you prep it? It may involve tearing out all the shotcrete, so it's so inundated with different ions, chloride ions, that type of thing.
My follow-up question to that would be, if you're not getting any bleed-throughs yet, and this spring, you're going to see this, and there's not quite a bleed-through, and we're going to actually do a renovation on that pool, is that something that needs to be sandblasted? Would you recommend a sandblast or water blast before a bond coat goes onto that pool? Or at that point, if there's no bleed-through, has there not been enough permeation through the plaster to get into the actual shotcreters on
It again depends on the depth of penetration, and that's where sometimes, the only way with 100% certainty, Chaz, you'll know, is a petrographic analysis, chloride analysis in depth of that material. And they can do a chloride analysis, 1152 in depth. Like they'll tell you, you got this much here, and as you go deeper in the material, if the number resides and gets smaller, you may be okay. But if you've got an extreme concentrated chloride, and especially things like magnesium chloride, which is expansive, you can do some real long-term serious damages to that structure.
Now, I'm going
We have a-
to put this question on the Florida guys, because they have a little more experience, I think. From hearing
Yeah,
what you got.
yeah,
What-
Pete-
You know, if you got, what has been a worst case or close to worst case scenario where you've had a pool that the customer just didn't do anything with it after a hurricane and let it sit? Have you run into these problems that Greg is explaining? And where did you take it? How did you handle it?
I didn't personally Pete, did you deal with much in the way of saltwater intrusion?
Our biggest problem wasn't really the salt water, was that we had pools that were down for up to a year and a half. So, I mean, you're talking with green water and tadpoles by the buckets. So there, you run into that problem, it's pretty much, it's drain into interior. At that point, if they've been sitting that long. Another issue we seen was from consumers throwing tabs in pools. They had no power, they had nothing available, they threw some tabs in, and they just burned right through the bottom. So, I mean, most of our hurricanes along the coast, we get the salt water, but up inland, and you got to remember, a lot of our hurricanes go 40, 50 miles inland, it's all storm damage. But a lot of the stuff that we run into falls under homeowners insurance if it's not flooding. And pretty much, we go out and give them an analysis of what we feel all the issues are, and then it's up to them and the insurance company to figure out how it's going to be handled. But surprising, I didn't hear that here at all from any of the questions.
Hang on, we have a question here first, and it's related to the concrete.
Well, it's related to the whole general thing with Hurricane Sandy. I believe that the way to address the Hurricane Sandy thing is, if I was to go to a homeowner, I'm going to just tell them straight up, you have to replace your motor, you have to replace your heater, you have to do everything that's metal, the controllers, they all have to be replaced. And then the electrician, you have to get an electrician, or if you have an electrician, he has to worry about all that other stuff, the control boards, the time clocks. As the structural part of the pool, where I do pools, we have a short period of time, we got to get the pools up and running. We don't have a long time to clean the pool, so get the pool clean, get it running, and worry about the structural part and address the structural part later. But the most important thing, I believe, is get the filtration system all, up and running and get that going and get the pool going, and the structural part could be waited later. As for a vinyl liner pool, you just have to take a risk, I think. Tell the homeowner what are the risks, drain the pool, clean it out, say, oh, they can lose the liner, but that's why I think, I think a lot of this stuff is being, overthought, with all the technical stuff, but we have to get it all up and running quick, and I think that's some of the stuff that he was asking, how we address all that stuff. Just let the homeowner aware of all the risks, and, and for their safety and for your safety, just to cover yourselves, and that's why I believe that the best way to handle the Hurricane Sandy thing.
That's correct. I can tell you, and I can understand all the need to be as gentle on your customer as you can, and you're going to find the biggest issue that we found in Central Florida was power. The pools would set for 2 or 3 weeks with no power. Those pump motors that were on the verge of going out, it was insane the number of pump motors we replaced. They'd be without power for 3 weeks, and maybe the bearings were beginning to go, and you didn't even know it. you didn't hear it yet, but it would set dormant for 3 weeks, and it was amazing how many pumps and motors that we would change out. I think you're going to be surprised that that'll happen. You're going to change a bunch of equipment. There's a lot of stuff just sitting dormant with no power. You're going to be surprised 2 to 3 years from now. You've heard it, I've heard it in Florida. It's the same thing's going on here that was going on there. A lot of the insurance companies are only doing partial payouts. They're not handling things right. Those homeowners, those pools are going to sit dormant for anywhere from the next 6 months to 3 years. I was redoing pools that were 3 and 4 years after the fact. Pools that were down in 2004, I was working on in 2008. You're going to be amazed by the amount of rehabs, vinyl liners you're going to replace, equipment that's going to sit for 2 or 3 years. You're going to go in, you're going to put new pumps on, you're going to drop new cartridge filters in, you're going to be putting new liners in. It was a substantial part of my business for a 3 to 4 year period after the 3 hurricanes that we went through in 2004.
All right, we're going to move on to, what do we
Is
have
it
time
related
for?
totally to
Yeah, I
this?
think so.
Okay,
Um,
one more.
Yeah, the structural thing, I'm wondering on the fiberglass pools, there shouldn't be any major problem with the intrusion of the surface, right? I mean, it's fiberglass, I mean, boats are fiberglass, I mean, question.
All fiberglass can have microscopic pores in that, particularly boat hulls, particularly Florida boats that are in the water year-round, get a water, I forget the technical name right now, get a water intrusion, and it forms blisters into the gel coat. And they will have to be ground out, they have to be dried out, they have to be sealed with a certain level of epoxy, and then you have to re-gel them. So there can be issues with, nothing is impervious, so to speak. Everything has some porosity to it. And that, this damage may not show up for quite a period of time in it, may not be instant.
Okay.